Okay, great. So we're going to cover the review today for the final exam, which is neurology. And I'm going to do a screen share and just make sure that you're all familiar with what you'll be doing, what you should be reviewing. Let me close some of this craziness out. I have so many things open. Okay. Okay, so you're going to be under your exam 4 folder, and there's a few files in there that you should look at. One is going to be the anatomy of the spinal cord, the other is going to be the anatomy of the spinal nerve, and the other will be anatomy of the brain. More than 90% of the exam is going to come from those 3 PDFs, so there's no surprises, okay? So if you're comfortable with that, and you'll do just fine. So let's look at the anatomy of the spinal cord and just review some of the keys. Again, we did this last week, but let's go through some of this. So in this cross section here, remember you've got these cervical nerves. There's 8 pairs up at top. You've got that cervical enlargement. In the neck, remember there's 2 plexus. There is a cervical plexus and a brachial plexus. In the lower back, there's a lumbar plexus and sacral plexus. But in the thoracic spine, there's only thoracic nerves. They're intercostal nerves, 12 pairs of that. And surrounding the spinal cord, you have those 3 layers of meninges, the piemata, arachnoid, and duromata. PEEP or PAD, PAD, from internal to superficial, it's piemata, closest to the spinal cord, arachnoid in the middle, duromata, most superficial and closest to the external surface of the bone. PAD, P-A-D, piemata, arachnoid, and duromata. If we zoom in a little bit at around the L1, L2 interspace between those 2 vertebrae, the spinal cord kind of tapers to an end right there, and that's the conus medullaris. And as you can see that there on the left, conus medullaris. And then this long extension down at the bottom, we'll look at another view, as it extends down, that's the filum terminale. All of this that looks like the horse's tail is the cauda equina. Now we'll zoom in a little bit here. Again, there's the L1, L2 interspace. There's the conus medullaris, the cone where the spinal cord tapers at the L1, L2 interspace. The cauda equina, horse's tail, which are all nerve root endings. And then you've got the filum terminale, which is that letter C right here. And then that long filament comes all the way down to the bottom and anchors down to the coccyx. It explains why if you slip on black ice or you land on your buttocks, there could be a full tug that happens when the coccyx goes anterior. It pulls on all that neurological tissue all the way up to the brain. You get this really, really bad migraine headache the next day.
So it's pulling on the filum terminale, you said?
The filum terminale is at that bottom, correct. Okay, the cervical enlargement is made up of a group of nerves, the cervical and brachial plexus. Here we can see the outside, that blue layer, number 17 is the duromata. Arachnoid is deep to it. The layer that's removed is the piemata, which we'll show you on the next slides coming up here. Now, if you were to see this model, this is the cross section. It looks like a cervical vertebrae because you see the bifid spinous process and you see the vertebral body. When you see the bone, you have good reference points as posterior and anterior, so that you could start naming things like dorsal horn, ventral horn, posterior median sulcus, anterior median fissure, right? So if you don't have or see the spinous process, let's say I were to show you a picture and we were honed in like to this view, let's make it a little small, let's say right there. Now you could still kind of figure it out without seeing the body and the spinous, because if you look at 18 and 19 towards the left, I mean, that spinal nerve, that's the dorsal root ganglia, the DRG. So the dorsal root ganglia comes into the back, into the dorsal rootlets, into the dorsal horn. Now, if I zoomed in more and this was all that you saw, now you're going, all right, how do I know what's anterior and what's posterior? I don't see a spinous process. I don't see a vertebral body. I don't see the DRG, the dorsal root ganglia. The only thing that makes it different is the appearance of the posterior columns, right? Because you have those two pieces of pie, the fasciculus gracilis and the fasciculus cuneatus, where you don't see the separation here. But also there's a major difference between the PMS, the posterior median sulcus, and the anterior median fissure, right? The anterior median fissure, that gap looks a little bit wider. And then the PMS, that slit looks like it comes all the way down to the inside. It's just very thin. So you have to be able to decipher where the PMS for the posterior median sulcus is versus the AMF, the anterior median fissure. Once you identify the anterior median fissure, then we know anterior horn. Once we see posterior median sulcus, then we know dorsal horn or posterior horn. Okay, so those are some key structures. Then we have the three meninges. Again, you got closest to the spinal cord, the pia mater. Then you have, looks like number 16, the arachnoid, and number 3, the dura mater. Okay. Then you have your spaces, the subarachnoid space. This is where your CSF flows, the cerebral spinal fluid. You have the subdural space, that little thin line between 3 and 16, it looks like. And then you have the epidural space, which is between number 5 and 3. Okay, these are your horns. You've got your dorsal horn, your ventral horn, and lateral horn. Now, lateral horn, they put this here. It's rare that you're going to see it in the cervical region. The lateral horns are really predominantly found between T1 and L2. But I guess they kind of put it here just to teach it. Most students aren't going to say, oh, is that a cervical vertebrae or a thoracic? They're just saying, here's a vertebra, and they put all horns there. But for our purposes, we know that these bifid spinuses are only seen in the cervical region, but yet the lateral horns make up the sympathetics. And the sympathetics are only found between T1 and L2. That's your thoracolumbar outflow. Here's your central canal right in the center. Your CSF is going to flow there right when it leaves through that fourth ventricle. And then the connection of that H is the gray commissure. So gray matter is that letter H, and everything around it is white matter, and the white matter is where your tracts are. Now let's look at the white matter. On the posterior side, you got the posterior white columns, or the dorsal columns, or dorsal white columns. If you just said dorsal columns or posterior columns, that's good enough. White, putting the word white in there, is just indicative of white matter, but it's not essential. Again, within the white, the posterior columns, here, this section of it would be more specifically the fasciculus gracilis, and the one that's more lateral, fasciculus cuneatus. This would be fasciculus gracilis, more lateral, fasciculus cuneatus. The gracilis deals with proprioceptive awareness, vibration, two-point discrimination for the lower extremity, whereas the cuneatus deals with those same things from the upper extremity. Lateral columns, anterior columns. Okay, let's look at the anatomy of the spinal nerve. So remember, this is a little bit of a typo. Yes and no, a little bit. I want to show you something. So here's the dorsal root ganglia, right? That large swollen portion. Here, let's say this first arrow, you see where it says dorsal root or posterior root? It's got two arrows. The arrow here, I would say, is the dorsal root, and then this arrow would be the dorsal rootlets, right? The smaller ones. If you look in there, they're much, much smaller. Those are rootlets. That's the root. Here, it's nicely labeled where number 17 is the ventral root or the anterior root, and then here would be the ventral rootlets, the smaller ones. Remember, all sensory input comes in this way, the dorsal root comes in, then you got that association neuron here or interneuron, and then from the anterior horn cells, motor output comes out through that motor neuron or ventral root. Okay, and then as it comes out further, right, this here is your dorsal ramus. I think it looks like 21, whereas number 20 is your ventral ramus. And the ventral rami, that makes up your plexus, whether it's the cervical plexus, brachial plexus, lumbar plexus, or sacral plexus. So here you go again. Here's your spinal nerve. We say spinal nerves are mixed nerves. They're mixed nerves because there's a dorsal and a ventral component, sensory and motor. So this is now your dorsal ramus going to the muscles of the back and the skin of the back. Then you got your ventral ramus or anterior ramus making up all the plexus, cervical plexus, brachial plexus, lumbar plexus, and sacral plexus. Again, remember there is no thoracic plexus. There's only intercostal nerves. Okay.
Can I ask a question when you get the chance, please?
Sure, go right ahead. You can go now.
Thanks. Are all of these points, all of these numbers, are they labeled across every single slide?
Everything that I'm showing you here, you have access to on Blackboard.
Okay.
Okay.
But these slides
Exactly
in particular,
what we're looking
I
at.
see that-
Exactly what I'm looking at, you have.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Okay, now let's look at the anatomy of the spinal nerve. The anatomy, again, this is really the same images all over again. So let's just see if there's anything new here that we didn't cover. I don't think so. But let's look at the peripheral nerves and plexi. So up in the cervical region, you've got the cervical and brachial plexus. Down in the lumbar region in the lower back, you got the lumbar and sacral plexus. Again, in the thoracic region, there is no plexus. There's only intercostal nerves. So we'll look at this structure here, this model, and see if we can break some of them down for you, okay? So here is the cervical plexus in the mid to upper portion, and most of that goes upward, with the exception of this one nerve that actually comes from C3, C4, and C5, which is the phrenic nerve. C3, 4, and 5 keep the diaphragm alive. C3, 4, and 5 keep the diaphragm alive. So the phrenic nerve goes to the diaphragm. Now let's look at the brachial plexus, which comes from the levels in the neck, C5 to T1, meaning C5, C6, C7, C8, and the T1 nerve root. Okay, we know there's only 7 cervical vertebrae, but there are 8 pairs of cervical nerve roots. These are the terminal branches of the brachial plexus, the axillary nerve, the musculocutaneous nerve, radial, ulnar, and median. If I were to ask any of these on a test, name the structure, you need to be thorough. You just can't write radial. You write radial nerve. Can't write ulnar, you gotta write ulnar nerve. So with all the nerves, make sure you put the word nerve with it. Okay, so the axillary nerve goes to the deltoid and the teres minor muscle. And the musculocutaneous goes to most of your arm muscles, like the biceps brachii, the coracobrachialis. Those are musculocutaneous. The radial nerve goes to anything that deals with extension of the shoulder, extension of the elbow, extension of the wrist, anything that, extension of the fingers, always radial nerve. Ulnar nerve and median nerve deal with the wrist and finger flexors mostly, and I would say 90% of them are innervated by the median nerve rather than the ulnar nerve. The ulnar nerve, I think, deals with really just 1.5 muscles. It deals with the flexor carpi ulnaris, and it deals with the 4th and 5th digit for the flexor digitorum profundus. Remember, the flexor digitorum profundus goes to these 4 digits. These 2 deal with median nerve, but these 2 are ulnar nerve, the 4th and 5th finger. Okay, so let's look at flat Stanley. Here's your brachial plexus, goes down the arm. And this is why understanding this key point helps you understand why so many pain syndromes and weaknesses from the shoulder down to the fingers. If someone's complaining of shoulder pain or weakness, or elbow pain or weakness, or wrist pain or weakness, or finger pain or weakness, remember when you step on a dog's tail, the dog barks at the mouth. But the problem is where you're pinching or stepping on the dog's tail. That's the cause of the problem. So many times you can get a pinch or a compression of the dog's tail here in the neck. And then it starts to refer and radiate down into the more distal areas. So here, now the brachial plexus, please mute your mics if it's on. I hear someone's on. So if your brachial plexus comes down, you start to see it wraps, that first nerve here wraps around the, just distal to the head of the humerus where that neck is, that's the axillary nerve. And then just distal to that, kind of going down the middle of the humerus, that's your musculocutaneous. And that's the one that goes to the biceps and the coracobrachialis, which is found right around mid-humerus. Now, when we start to look more distal to that, down in that forearm area, you can see there's a nerve on the radial bone side, there's a nerve on the ulnar bone side, and then there's a nerve that's kind of right in between. So that's the way I would think about the forearm. So the nerve that follows the lateral side where the thumb is, that's the radial nerve. The nerve that follows the more medial side where the ulnar bone is, that's the ulnar nerve. And the nerve that's in the middle between the two is the median nerve, not middle nerve, median nerve. That median nerve comes down right here. And if you remember, on the muscle exam, one of the questions was the flexor retinaculum or volar ligament or transverse carpal ligament. So that ligament goes across this way, attaching to the lateral 2 carpal bones to the medial 2 carpal bones. And underneath that and deep to that is where the median nerve travels. And it can get compressed if the person's using their fingers a lot and those finger flexors and wrist flexors hypertrophy and thicken. Now you have the median nerve getting compressed in the carpal tunnel called carpal tunnel syndrome, where you have pain, tingling, paresthesia, which means abnormal sensation to 3.5 fingers. And again, from anatomical position, 1, 2, 3, and half of the ring finger. 1, 2, 3, and half of the ring finger is all median nerve. You get lightning pain, shooting pain, numbness, tingling, and you can even get atrophy of these muscles right here. These muscles are called the thenar pad muscles. When these atrophy, you have the inability to use the opposable thumb, and the thumb falls in this position called apand. Okay. All right, let's move down a little bit. Again, in the thoracic region, you have these intercostal nerves. You don't have to call them thoracic intercostal nerves, just intercostal nerves. They go in between each rib where you have intercostal muscles. Lower back, lumbar plexus and sacral plexus. Here you go, there's on flat Stanley, we can see the intercostal nerves. This is where shingles loves to attack, by the way. That virus, herpes zoster, loves to sit in the dorsal root ganglia. And then when the person's immune system becomes weak, that virus comes out and starts to express itself through peripheral nerves, like the intercostal nerves, or they love dermatomes, especially that of the face where you have the trigeminal nerve. The shingles can attack either the ophthalmic branch, the maxillary branch, or the mandibular branch, V1, V2, or V3 of the trigeminal nerve. When we come down in the lower back, here's your lumbar plexus, and the 2 big nerves there are the femoral and obturator nerve. You can see the femoral nerve coming right down here in front of the femur. Then it kind of hides itself and disappears in the back, whereas the obturator goes right through that large foramen called the obturator foramen. Sacral plexus, a little bit more inferior than that. And the most largest famous nerve in the body is that sciatic nerve, where it comes down to the posterior femur. And the sciatic nerve is made up of the common peroneal and the tibial nerve. So we're going to see somewhere at the knee level that the sciatic is going to split into a tibial and common peroneal nerve. So here, right up here, right around the head of the fibula, is the common peroneal nerve. Now, anything with the word common, it's safe to assume it's going to divide into two things, and it does. It divides into a deep peroneal, which goes to all of the dorsiflexors of the foot, like tibialis anterior, and all of the anterior muscles of the leg and top of the dorsum of the foot. That's all of the dorsiflexors are innervated by the deep peroneal nerve, which actually comes from all the way the lumbar spine, L4. So L4 is your dorsiflexor tibialis anterior. All kind of rhymes. Deep peroneal nerve comes from L4, goes to the tibialis anterior, which is a dorsiflexor. All right. So the common peroneal divides into a deep peroneal and a superficial peroneal. The superficial peroneal stays superficial along the lateral side of the leg. That's when you sit with your legs crossed and your foot goes numb in class. It's the superficial peroneal that's getting compressed. Okay, and then we have the tibial nerve. Here it's called the posterior tibial nerve or tibial nerve. Right down here, it goes down the posterior calf, all the way down to the calcaneus, and then underneath the calcaneus, it divides. It divides, one going to the medial side of the foot, the other to the lateral side of the foot, where it changes its name to the medial plantar nerve and lateral plantar nerve. Okay, and I want you to take a good look at the picture, because here on your reading left, you're looking at the anterior leg and anterior foot, but on your reading right, which is an anatomical position, this person's left leg and foot, you can see the foot is turned outward, giving us a different perspective. So we can see the anterior leg and the posterior. You can see the anterior compartment and posterior compartment of the leg. The posterior compartment are plantar flexors. That's the tibial nerve. Anterior compartment, deep peroneal nerve. Okay. All right. Spinal cord reflex, the model that we looked at in class here is this model. This is your reflex arc model. There are 5 moving parts to it. If we look at here, the skin, let's say you take a pinprick or a thumbtack or something hot or super cold, and you touch the skin, you have these tactile receptors that pick up pain there and temperature. So the receptors are on the skin. Then the receptors are going to relay that information into that yellow nerve, which is a sensory neuron. And that information is going to come in to this is your sensory neuron. It's going to go into the dorsal root ganglia, right? That's a dorsal root ganglia. Into the dorsal horn, it's going to take that sensory input, relay it to the association neuron, aka intergrating neuron or interneuron. Association neuron, interneuron, or integrating neuron. Most of your textbooks will use not integrating, but they will use interneuron, which is appropriate, or association neuron. I'm not a big fan of this term integrating neuron. It's not really the official term. So please use association neuron or interneuron if that pops up. Then this association neuron or interneuron is the relay man, and it relays that sensory input to the motor neuron. And the motor neuron, or that efferent neuron, is going to relay that motor output to the effector. In this case, the effector is a muscle, but it could be a gland, and it could be a tissue. But here, again, the 5 parts of the reflex arc: receptor, sensory neuron, association neuron, motor neuron, and the effector. Okay. And we'll finish up here with the anatomy of the brain, just reviewing some of the key elements. So when this is a bird's eye view looking down, you have these elevated portions that are called gyri or gyrus, and then you have the deeper valleys of the mountains that are called sulcus. Looking at the individual, we have a left hemisphere and a right hemisphere. Your left hemisphere is more linear, more language-based. The majority of the speech center is in the left hemisphere, called Broca's area, number 44. The right area is more associated with artsy stuff, arts, facial recognition, looking at a room and knowing, hey, the furniture will go better here, dress coordination, knowing what colors you can wear, what looks good, what doesn't. That's more right hemisphere. Left is more linear, math, science, and language. So when they say, oh, he or she is more left-brained, or he or she is more right-brained, based on talents, that's kind of the idea. Okay, let's move up a little bit. I'm not a big fan of these pictures, so you're probably not going to see this one. This is a nice picture where you can see in this section, which is your coronal section, where it separates into a frontal and posterior side. The outside is gray matter. That's the cortex. The inside is white matter. Okay. Let's scroll down a little bit more. Now, again, still bird's eye view looking down. We have a longitudinal fissure separating the 2 hemispheres. And when I say separating, it's not like you can go in there and pull them apart. Remember, you have white matter connecting both hemispheres together. The white matter going back and forth, who knows what that's called? Anyone know what that's called? Connecting left and right hemisphere?
The corpus callosum.
Thank you very much. The corpus callosum. Women tend to have a much thicker connection and better connection, left to right hemisphere, than males do. If we look further than that, let's scroll down here. Between the occipital lobe and the cerebellum is the transverse fissure. The central sulcus is a key landmark. The central sulcus is a key landmark which helps us differentiate the pre-central gyrus from the post-central gyrus. So when we look here from this view, the lateral view, here's the central sulcus, right? You see that groove, the valley that comes all the way down between the frontal lobe and the parietal lobe. It comes right down to the temporal lobe, right there. So the red is the pre-central gyrus. That's your motor strip where the homunculus is. The blue is the post-central gyrus, or the primary sensory area. Between, we have another groove called the lateral sulcus. So this is your central sulcus. This is your lateral sulcus. This is your frontal lobe. This is your parietal lobe. This is your temporal lobe. Back here in the green, occipital lobe. From the underneath surface, you can see these 2 yellow regions. This is the one called the olfactory nerve. The olfactory nerve is cranial nerve 1. At the very end is the olfactory bulb. This is olfactory tract or olfactory nerve, cranial nerve 1 for sense of smell. Here is cranial nerve number 2. This is your right optic nerve, left optic nerve, and where the 2 crisscross right there is called the optic chiasm. The chiasm is the crisscross. frontal lobe, parietal lobe, occipital lobe, and temporal lobe. From the lateral view, again, we could see the primary motor strip or precentral gyrus, and that's part of the frontal lobe. When you look on the posterior portion in the parietal region, there's your postcentral gyrus, which is all sensory, motor. This is your precentral gyrus, postcentral gyrus. Between the two, central sulcus. This is the lateral sulcus. Occipital lobe on the posterior, that's your primary visual center region. Here is your auditory, for hearing, your auditory cortex and the association cortex. So the association cortex, the auditory cortex actually allows you to hear. And then the auditory association area is, okay, you know you can hear Dr. Lindner's voice, you hear vibration and sound. Now, whose voice is that? The wheels spin in the brain, and then you can identify and know that it's Dr. Lindner, and that's part of the temporal lobe. The insula is deeper to that. You have to peel away the temporal lobe and look deep to see the insula. Corpus callosum, that's white matter that connects both sides of the hemispheres of the brain. The septum pellucidum is this septum, it's like a wall that separates right and left hemisphere, but more specifically, the left and right ventricle from each other. Again, corpus callosum, septum pellucidum, you see it separates the lateral ventricles from one another. Inferior here is the fornix. If we look a little further, here is the medulla, here is the pons, here's the midbrain. We'll see those again coming up. This is the thalamus, and then there's that interthalamic adhesion. Thalamus is here, below it, hypothalamus. Thalamus, hypothalamus. Thalamus, interthalamic adhesion, hypothalamus. The hypothalamus controls the autonomic neural system. So again, thalamus, interthalamic adhesion, hypothalamus. There's a connection going from the hypothalamus into the pituitary, and that connection is the infundibulum. The connection from the hypothalamus into the pituitary is mostly posterior. It's the neurohypophysis, which is the posterior pituitary. The anterior pituitary is called the adenohypophysis. This is the hypophyseal fossa that's part of the sella turcica. Hypophyseal fossa, neurohypophysis, adenohypophysis. Both adenohypophysis and neurohypophysis are part of the pituitary. Adenohypophysis is the anterior pituitary. Neurohypophysis is the posterior pituitary. The neurohypophysis has axons connecting from the hypothalamus down into the infundibulum to the posterior pituitary. Here's the choroid plexus. Choroid plexus is lined with ependymal cells. Ependymal cells help to produce cerebral spinal fluid. Pineal gland is posterior. Don't confuse that with the pituitary. Now, right back here, this is your superior colliculus and inferior colliculus. If you had both left and right parts of the brain connected, and we rotated that view to the posterior, we'd have two superior colliculi, two inferior colliculi, which makes up the corpora quadrigemina. I think there may be a picture of that coming up. Okay, so the brainstem is made up of the medulla, the pons, and the midbrain. Here's the midbrain. Again, you can see superior and inferior colliculi or colliculus, pons, medulla. The medulla is protected by the C1 and C2 vertebrae. And here is the midbrain, right here. So this section here, if we look at these two bumps, this and this, that's the same as this and this, just from a different view. So when we rotate it posteriorly, we can see the superior colliculus, that's for eye tracking and your eye movements. And then you have your inferior colliculus. This helps turn the head with auditory stimulus to the ears. Lower than that is the pons and medulla. Medulla, pons, midbrain. The four together is referred to as the corpora quadrigemina, which means the body of four. Here's your cerebellum. Cerebellum is mostly for balance and coordination. The center part of the cerebellum is the vermis, left and right cerebellar hemisphere, not to be confused with right and left cerebral hemisphere. Cerebral hemisphere are the two main parts of the cerebrum. Cerebellar hemispheres refer to the cerebellum. When we pull them apart, you can see the white matter called the arbor vitae and the gray matter called the cerebellar cortex. So this is the cerebellar cortex or gray matter on the outside. Arbor vitae, which means tree of life. Those are the veins of the leaf. The other name for the cerebellar cortex is called folia. Folia, which means foliage. Now we're looking at the ventricles. We have these few pictures of the ventricles. So this view is a bird's eye view looking down. We could see the right and left ventricle, or ventricle 1 and ventricle 2, or ventricle 1, ventricle 2, lateral ventricle, lateral ventricle. There's two lateral ventricles. That's the take-home message. After the fluid exits the lateral ventricles, it's got to go through the interventricular foramen, also known as the interventricular foramen of Monro. After it leaves the interventricular foramen of Monro, it goes into this structure. From this view, this is the third ventricle, which is here, third ventricle. To go from the third ventricle down into the fourth ventricle, it's got to go through the cerebral aqueduct or cerebral aqueduct of Sylvius. So here's the fourth ventricle, and you can see from there, the CSF can escape laterally through the lateral aperture, or medial down the medial aperture, where now it goes through the center of the spinal cord where that central canal is, where that gray commissure is. Okay. Okay, and let's see what else we have. Those are three great models. Special senses. Let's just click on this for a sec. With the ear and the eye, let's just see if we can bring this up. So with the eye, some of the basic terms right in the center, that's your pupil. The colored portion is the iris, and then the white part is the sclera. And cranial nerve 1, 2, 3, 4, and 6 all deal with the eye, but vision is cranial nerve 2. And then you'll have cranial nerve 3 that's involved with the light reflex when you shine light into someone's eyes. You have the cornea, which is this clear translucent shell, the shiny part that you see. Again, you can see the pupil, the black portion, the iris is the color portion, the white is the sclera, and then you remember the muscles. Superior rectus, inferior rectus, lateral rectus. On the inside is the medial rectus. On the top is the superior oblique, and on the bottom, can't see it from this view, but we have an inferior oblique. When you look at the eye from the lateral perspective, there's the cornea. Here's the lens that can alter in its shape. And then here is the anterior compartment, or the aqueous humor, and then the vitreous humor is the posterior compartment back here. Pupil, iris, the white part here is the sclera. Choroid is everything here in the brown is the choroid. That's kind of like the middle layer. So you have the sclera, which is outside, the choroid, which is more middle, it's highly vascular, and then you go all the way to the inside where you have the retina, which has all the receptors, right? You can kind of see back here is the retina. Choroid is more superficial. Retina is the deepest, choroid is the middle, and the most superficial would be the sclera. The lens would sit here. The lens would sit here. And then here you have the ciliary muscle that attaches to the lens that can alter its shape, right? So here is the ciliary muscle. Here is the lens, and you could see the attachment. There are these ligaments that attach to the lens that can alter its shape. Whereas all the light and visual input come in through the pupil, it hits the lens, and all of that data, all the information then goes through into the retina, which is where you have your receptors. You have your rods and cones back there. I like this view because it shows the three layers, the sclera, the choroid, and the retina, okay? Again, a nice view showing visual input coming through the cornea. Here is the iris. Here is the lens. You could see the ligaments, the ciliary muscle and the ciliary suspensory ligaments. And back here, you have your nerve, you have your arteries, your veins. It's actually the only place in the body that you can look to see arteries, veins, and nerves without cutting the skin. You just need a fundoscope to look in to look, and you can pick up a lot of metabolic issue. You pick up high blood pressure, you can pick up diabetes. We look at the ratio to the artery and veins to one another. When we look at the ear, sound waves come in through the funnel. Think of this as a funnel. This is called the auricle or pinna. I think pinna is the more appropriate name for this, although some call it the auricle. Pinna, P-I-N-A. Then the sound waves, the pinna collects the sound waves. It comes into the external auditory or external acoustic meatus. The sound waves come in. They hit the tympanic membrane. This will vibrate. That vibration then moves the three bones, the malleus, the incus, and the stapes. The vibration shakes the window, that oval window, and then the vibration comes in and shakes all the fluid in here in the cochlea. The cochlea has fluid and has lots of little hair-like projections in there. Then the vibration and the oscillatory movement of those hairs inside the cochlea in the organ of Corti stimulates the cochlear nerve. Now together, these two make up the vestibular cochlear nerve, but this portion specifically right here going to the cochlea is the cochlear portion of the vestibular cochlear nerve. The one going to the canals, the semicircular canals, the anterior canal, posterior canal, and lateral canal, this nerve is called the vestibular portion of the vestibulocochlear nerve. Cochlear deals with hearing. The semicircular canals deals with your sense of balance. Every time your head moves, whether it be in a y-axis, x-axis, or z-axis, there's fluid, there's endolymph here inside the semicircular canals, and these little crystals that move that stimulate, again, other hair-like projections that give feedback as to the position of your head so that you can send output to your paraspinal muscles to balance you, so that if you're leaning to the left, you don't want to avoid spilling over to the left, so muscles on the right side of your spine contract to pull you the other way for balance. Many forms of scoliosis come from an imbalance here to the semicircular canals from traumatic birth, when the head is compressed here by forceps or by strong hands, and it distorts the temporal lobe, which is here. When you distort the temporal lobe, you can really distort the structure of what's happening in the semicircular canals. So now you get this aberrant output to your paraspinal muscles on one side of your body pulling the spine, and you get these abnormal curvatures. They try and correct them by using rods and splints, but many times when they say it's idiopathic, like unknown cause, it can come from the semicircular canals. Okay, again, a nice view showing the tympanic membrane here. Then you have the malleus, the incus, the stapes, the three smallest bones in the body, the oval window. Here's the cochlea. This is the cochlear branch of the vestibulocochlear nerve, and this is the vestibular portion of the vestibulocochlear nerve. These are the semicircular canals for balance. This is the cochlea that has the organ of Corti inside for hearing. Together, it's the vestibular cochlear nerve. Here is the model. Here's the auricle or the pinna, external auditory meatus or external acoustic meatus, tympanic membrane, which is the eardrum. You want to refer to this as the tympanic membrane. Then you have your malleus, you have your incus, and you have the stapes. Here you can see the semicircular canals that attach to the vestibule. That's where you have the vestibular portion of the vestibulocochlear nerve. And then you have the cochlear, and on the other, the posterior side of that, the cochlear portion of the vestibulocochlear nerve. On this side of the eardrum or the tympanic membrane is the eustachian tube, also known as the auditory tube. We want the air pressure on this side and the pressure on this side to be equal. Otherwise, when atmospheric pressure changes and the shape of the tympanic membrane gets altered, you get that clogged feeling. That's when you hold your nose, you blow out, or you yawn to try and equalize the pressure on the outside and inside of the tympanic membrane. Again, bird's eye view, malleus, incus, stapes, semicircular canals. This is the anterior canal, this is the posterior canal, and this is the horizontal canal. This is the vestibule, cochlea. This is the cochlear portion of the vestibulocochlear nerve, and the other one would be the vestibular portion. The same structure is just all separated. So you can see here, malleus, incus, stapes, vestibule, semicircular canals. This is your anterior, posterior, and lateral canal, cochlear nerve, and vestibular nerve. Okay, and the rest of those we have already done. There's nothing new there. So let me get back into, let me stop the screen share and see if you guys have any questions. Let me just stop the recording here and see if you have any questions. Again, the exam will be very straightforward. It'll be 50 questions, but it'll be 25 stations, right? 25 pictures, 2 pictures per question, always an A and a B. You'll type in your answer. You don't go to the common site for this exam. You go to your course, and you'll see on the left-hand side, it'll say Neuro exam or Neuro Lab exam. It will open up during the start of your class time, and it's a timed exam. I think it's 50 minutes. It's plenty of time. It gives you more than, it's basically 2 minutes, a slide there. It shows one at a time, one image at a time, and you know your answer, you type it in, and it's complete. This exam does not allow you to go back, okay? So once you complete it and the answer is in, you can only go forward. When you go forward, take your time, you'll have a full 2 minutes. If you finish sooner, just go to the next answer, okay? But this exam doesn't allow you to go back and forth. The exam opens up, if you have me at 11:30, it opens up at 11:30. It closes 50 minutes thereafter, and you can't come in after and take it. If you have me at 5:30, it opens up at 5:30. The timer starts, you have 50 minutes, and at the end of the 50 minutes, the exam shuts down and you can't get in afterwards. So it's only during your class time. Just like in class, if you came late, you weren't allowed to come in to take the exam. We're holding everyone, to that same standard. Let me stop the recording here.